So my name's Stuart Murray. I work in the English department at the University of Leeds, and I'm the director of the university's Centre for Medical Humanities. What work is it that hands do? We know the way in which they act in terms of utility, in terms of function. They help us to grasp things, to pick things up, to put things down, to hold things, to move, to push. But I think we're all aware that hands do a variety of other kinds of work as well. They express emotion. They convey all sorts of feelings. And this project was interested in that sense of thinking about the way that hands work. And a number of staff at the University of Leeds got together in order to see how we might try and reconfigure some of these ideas by coming at them specifically through a disability studies point of view. So, thinking about prosthetic hands, for example, thinking about hands that are designed and made very much as a kind of replacement. What function does a prosthetic hand perform? How could that function be thought differently by taking into account the physical difference, for example, that a disabled hand might bring? And then we thought about this through questions of design and production. Why would you deliberately make a prosthetic or artificial hand that had disability at its core? Why would you choose to put a hand together, for example, using this one, which had fewer digits than is normal? Why would you choose to make it do things that are physically impossible for the hands that we have? These questions kind of animated our thinking because we thought that they could articulate ways of understanding the work that hands do in a different way, making people self-conscious about their hands, making people think through the issues of disability.
I'm Raymond Holt. I'm a lecturer in the School of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Leeds, where I teach product design. My research is mainly around the area of rehabilitation, robotics and assistive technology. So the project is a year-long project funded through the British Academy, through its APEX scheme, which is intended to promote multidisciplinary projects. And in this case, it's a collaboration between mechanical engineering and the School of English, which is quite an unusual combination. And that's really at the heart of the project, this idea of engineering the imagination. How do engineers respond to some of the concepts from, for example, cultural studies, disability studies, and how can those disciplines, the humanities, make use of engineering methods to explore and investigate some of those concepts that they deal with? So we're thinking particularly around things like embodiment, particularly using the hands as an example.
One of the things that was really exciting about this project was the people that it brought together. So a number of us come out of traditions of literary and cultural studies, where the body is theorized in certain ways to do with its relation to identity or to do with its relation to the ways that our bodies operates in the world. But we were in conversation as well with people in engineering, with people whose job it is to work with clients to design and produce prostheses which are then used in the world. And it was the meeting of those different approaches to the very similar artifact, object, if you like, that we were interested in, that was so rewarding. There was a real sense in our first meetings that we had to open up and listen to the critical thinking of other disciplines, to the methodologies of other disciplines, to the practicalities of other disciplines. I learned, for example, that it's all very well for me to think of the way in which hands might configure touch or emotion or identity, but I never have to think about, for example, the way in which that has to be articulated in the hand through motors or through wires. And I think in a sense of reciprocity, we're also working with colleagues in engineering and robotics who were interested in the things we might have to say about how hands are theorized within narrative, for example, the kind of work that hands do in fiction or in film. Bringing all of that together created this fabulous dynamic, I think, which the project was able to harness and move forward with.
So I first met Stuart through some medical humanities workshops that we were participating in. It was part of a university exercise to bring together people from different disciplines. And we got talking about our interests in technology and the need for engineers and people from the humanities to work together. And we clearly felt there was some need for collaboration, so we set up a reading group initially of people who were interested, looking at representations of things like prosthetics, body augmentation, and that kind of thing. And then that led on to an internally funded Sadler seminar series, and also a Wellcome Trust funded Seed Award with some colleagues down at Sheffield Robotics and the University of Exeter as well. And we also, when we saw the Apex call come out, we thought it seemed like a great opportunity to get some unusual cross-disciplinary funding to look at our ideas, and that was really where the project came from. So we were thinking about what is it that we can model. The hands seemed like an obvious place to start, so that was kind of the idea behind the project.
Nook and I both went to the University of Leeds where we studied product design, and Ray was actually, funny enough, one of our lecturers. So we worked with him for a few years. And when we left uni, we got involved with research projects at the University of Leeds. And so when Ray contacted us about this, we just thought it was such an exciting opportunity. We just couldn't turn it down. So one of the things that we were really involved in is looking at actually creating the shape of the hand. So, you know, Stuart had all these amazing ideas about where we should go with the project, and we spent a long time discussing it. And our part was actually bringing it to life with the help of Ray really working on the mechanics of the hand. So we spent a lot of time working on the CAD modelling, and also considering the exhibition design and how the flow of people would work around that. So in case of this project, it's really amazing to sort of take all these discussions and ideas, looking at putting empathy through a hand and really trying to convey that through an object. It's sort of quite different from the usual stuff we do, but it's just so interesting, really thinking outside the box for this project.
I think it's been really interesting. We always said we pride ourselves in being able to work in multidisciplinary teams, so that involves product designers, engineers, but never really from English or culture. So looking at how Stuart works and how Ray works, it's almost like complete opposite ends of the spectrum, and but seeing how they compromise on their ideas and how they meet in the middle. Sometimes Stuart would say one thing, Ray would say another, but they'd always find a solution. So halfway through the project I broke my fingers, and even then I was like, I've lost half the function of my right hand. But really, hands are such an important part of our day-to-day life in function as well as conveying emotion and communicating, and you don't really consider that until you really focus on it. And another aspect, I guess, is looking at the emotional side of developing prosthetic hands for the future. You could have a really linear process of increasing functionality and aesthetics, but really how it connects to the people and how the other facets of what hands offer to the human race, really.
So the design of engineering the imagination was, in a way, precisely to pick up on those keywords of the title, wasn't it? Engineering and imagination. We were working with both words and ideas like augmentation and enhancement. And in literary and cultural studies, those words get used a lot. And they're often used in terms of ideas of the body, embodiment, and a lot of that is metaphorical. So there will be concepts like prosthetic culture or prosthetic memory, and they will describe the way in which bodies, normative bodies or disabled bodies, work in the world. And what I thought would be really instructive and exciting would be to take those words, those ideas, to someone like yourself, whose job, whose research interest is to design and produce an augmented piece. Mm-hmm. And so that was the start, really, wasn't it?
Yes, and it's an interesting challenge. I mean, the very phrase, engineering the imagination, how does one engineer the imagination? Normally when we're talking about engineering, you need something that is quite well defined. We often worry about the fuzzy front end, where we're trying to decide what is it that we're going to engineer. How do we move from the kind of the abstract, poorly defined real world problems that we're trying to address into something that's very specific, very precise, that we can then say, right, this is the problem, it needs to be this strong, it needs to move this amount of weight, it needs to apply this amount of energy, it needs to fit into this amount of space, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the phrase engineer comes from one who is ingenious. So, you know, imagination is almost inherent in the idea of engineering. So what that means is that by focusing on hands, in this case, that actually gave us something to really deal with, because, you know, from the starting point, we could have focused on almost anything. There are so many different ways that you could augment or enhance or improve the body. And of course, again, in terms of both disability and assistive technology and, you know, prostheses, there are all these kind of different areas, but they're slightly different and they involve slightly different approaches to actually making things and different technical challenges in the design.
Yeah. So we wanted to see how that sense, if you like, of the factual, the grounded nature of engineering, the abstract nature of critical or creative imagination could come together. And we wanted to see their similarities, but not collapse one into another in a certain kind of language, not privilege one. And so the reason that we chose to look at hands was precisely because they are one of the most expressive parts of the body. And the idea, if you like, of handedness, of the way in which hands express and convey all sorts of emotions, all sorts of feelings, all sorts of thoughts, but also literally in the way in which the nerves of hands work, the signals they send to the brain. There's such complexity there. We want to take the work that we've done to the public. We want to put the hands that we have, the hands that we're making, in front of people and ask them, what do they think about their hands? What do they think about the way that their hands work? How much is that changed when you're made self-conscious about the shapes of hands? How surprising might it be to find a deliberately designed, disabled prosthetic hand? We like the idea that the arguments, the discussion, the debates that those moments will produce can be really enlightening in helping us think not just of our theories of hands, but also the actual business of what we think a prosthetic hand is made for and what it does. And so what we did then was we took these and we engaged with the public, didn't we? We in effect exhibited them, we put them on the table, we asked people to come and touch them and feel them and get self-conscious about them. And I thought the results were really interesting, because in effect we made them idea objects. You know, they drove the sorts of questions that we want to put to people. So people asked, what are they for? Who uses them and how? And I found I fell into any number of really interesting and provocative conversations that came from that. Somebody walking up to these who had not thought about these questions at all. And we had really interesting conversations, didn't we?
Yeah, it's really interesting seeing how people respond to them on first glance, because you know, there are questions about, well, why would you add an extra digit? Surely you must be doing it because you think there is some functional advantage. And you get some, you know, comments about how would you play the piano? Or, you know, one lady said, well, nobody would want this because it just looks too atypical, too different. It would attract attention. And so sometimes I didn't know whether people would say, you know, after a bit of conversation, they would say, oh yes, I would want one of these because it's more, because there would be benefits to it, just because that's what they felt like they should say.
I mean, basically we were asking people, if you had a new hand tomorrow, what would you want it to be? And there were a few people who said, I'd want it to kind of make a statement about myself. So I'd want it to be a different colour, a different texture. And that was interesting, that immediately there were some people who were saying, I wouldn't want it to be normal, you know, in any way. Most people, when we asked that question, what would you want your new hand to do? They kind of said in slightly fuzzy ways, actually, I'd want it to do most of what I do now. And then that, I think, in some ways they were slightly cautious and nervous about the question.
But it's interesting challenge, isn't it? That once a hand is artificial and you can design it to do anything you want, you've got this problem of consumer terror almost. Okay, what would I want it to do? So, you know, you look at things like when you could put in an RFID tag, so you could do near field communication to somebody's phone, for example. But is that good? Maybe if everybody was having RFID tags in their hands, it would become the norm, and that's something that we'd be using to unlock things. And I mean, you already hear about people putting in, you know, microchips so they can access buildings and that kind of thing.
And so what we found when we sort of came to the end of this phase of the project was we extrapolated back out from hands. So hands have been our object, hands have been our focus, but we realized that what we were learning from hands kind of applied to all sorts of wider questions of design, of the apprehension of embodiment, and the practicalities of process. I mean, like what did literally having to 3D print these, what did that do to your sense of how design and production takes place?
Well, it throws up some really interesting challenges. I mean, in this particular case, these were the first builds that we made of these hands, and normally you would want to go through, you know, 3, 4, 5 iterations before you finalise the design, because you start running into all these problems like how well do the wires fit in? You know, some of the holes sometimes aren't quite big enough, so they get clogged up, or you can't quite get the joints in the way that you'd like. Or even things like, you know, the fingers are sprung, so the tendon wires are attached to some elastic bands inside, so they'll spring back into position. But again, you know, you think, oh, you know, if we'd had stronger supports inside, we could have used a stronger spring, and they could have gripped things. Yeah. You know, I mean, that would have been nice to have like a lunate thumb that could actually hold something, and then you could do a conventional grasp and a lunate grasp, which are all these issues that, when you look back, it seems obvious. Actually, you think, oh, actually, why didn't we think of that up front? But it's always this challenge. You know, everyone has 20/20 hindsight, as they say, and foreseeing these things is actually quite a challenge.
Yeah. This focus on hands is part of a wider project that we're doing, which is to ask, how are technologies imagined when we're thinking of future disability experiences, of future disability lives? There's so much in the media at the moment about the role that robotics plays and will come to play in the lives of all of us. There's almost a giddy excitement of the sense in which technology will make futures possible. But I'm always struck by the ways in which those having those debates rarely talk to people who live with those technologies at the moment. Rarely talk to people, for example, in wheelchairs, whose day-to-day life is conducted through an interaction with technology. Rarely talk to people who have prosthetic limbs. And so what we're hoping is some of the things we learn from our hand project can work towards this wider idea in which people coming from literary studies, from cultural studies, people interested in narrative and interested in film, will have conversations with roboticists, with philosophers whose job is to think through, or in many cases to actually design and make, the technologies of the future, the technologies that will shape lives of those with disabilities, the technologies that are already making disability experiences what they are.